Time to abandon ship.
Oh no!
Here we go!
Can I persuade you to join us for a drink? It's a tradition.
Here, here.
Jar Jar, homie, my main man, quickly. Before the Separatists attack, get into the escape pod.
Hey! This is escape, then we're the pod.
Welcome back to Star Wars Escape Pod and another special guest episode with our co-host Blake. We have Dr. Krista Noble on this week talking about her recently released book, One with the Force. And we're going to be diving into all the inspirations behind the Force, behind what makes the Force tick, I guess. You know, all the things that inspired George, creating the Force, and so many things to talk about there. So we'll dive in with Dr. Krista Noble and get going on this.
Another happy landing.
How are you here?
I am a manifestation of the Force. A force that consists of two parts. Living beings generate the living force, which in turn powers the wellspring that is the cosmic force.
Show yourself, can you?
I cannot. My training was incomplete.
All right, a little clip there from Star Wars The Clone Wars when Yoda talks to Qui-Gon on Dagobah, one of my favorite story arcs there. A lot of stuff about the Force in that story arc, but I was thinking about that, as we were going down the list of questions to ask you, and that we're welcoming to the podcast this week, Dr. Krista Noble. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure and so cool to be talking about a book that you're writing, and just to kick things off, I guess, before we really dive into the meat of our conversation today, we just have some like light questions just to kind of get going, for audiences, listeners that might want to know a little bit about you. So just a few small questions here. So first thing is something I'm curious about, something we're always curious about this one, but how did you find the podcast?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Yeah.
Honestly, just looking at different podcasts online, and I listened to a clip from you guys, and you seem to have a nice vibe, good conversational feel to it. And then, of course, just when I do my particular pitch for my book, and being able to share that, and then hearing whether the individual is receptive to those ideas, obviously that increases my desire to appear on any particular podcast.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks so much for that.
We feel honored, honestly.
Yeah. It's a huge honor to be reached out to. Normally we're the ones kind of reaching out to other people and asking, but yeah, thank you so much for finding us and requesting us to host you on here. Cause yeah, it's, otherwise I wouldn't have known. So yeah, very cool.
Oh, thank you guys.
Yeah. So I'm assuming you're a Star Wars fan. You're writing a book in relation to Star Wars. So what makes you a Star Wars fan? How did you first kind of come into contact with this galaxy far, far away, and what makes you a Star Wars fan?
Yeah, I've loved it from the beginning. I watched the original trilogy with my parents when I was a kid. That's how I was first introduced. And I grew up in a family of meditators, and we discussed philosophy around the dinner table, and we read books on it and stuff. That was just normal. That's how I grew up. And so that gave me a lens when I watched the Star Wars movies. I could tell there were some very deep philosophical, spiritual principles in there. Not only Christian or Western principles, but also some very deep Eastern principles in there. So that inspired me when I watched them. I felt like there was a lot of depth there. And then later on, I decided to explore it more systematically using my academic background that I cultivated over time.
Awesome. Very cool.
And it's such a good insight, because I feel like a lot of people, when they watch Star Wars, at least for myself, I guess speaking from my perspective, you can kind of get this sense of this depth of this of like the Force and everything kind of going on behind the scenes. Like it really feels like George put a lot of emphasis on trying to actually make it feel like it's a real living entity. There's all this spirituality and things around it. And even if you don't pick on that immediately, you can kind of just feel that there's that detail behind the scenes, unlike a lot of stuff that maybe falls a little more flat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are some of your favorite Star Wars stories? I mean, having grown up with the original trilogy, there's so much now. So what's a standout for you? You know,
as in a movie,
as in almost anything. I mean, it's amazing having chats with so many people over the years now that their first coming to contact with Star Wars may have been a video game or a book or a comic or an animated show now or a live action show or anything like that, or a movie. So yeah, what's a standout for you as like a number one? This is like, you know, the peak more recent, peak Star Wars for you. Well, what's peak Star Wars for you? Yeah.
I'm a big fan of Return of the Jedi, to be honest.
Nice.
I felt like it just brought all the themes together of that series so well. But I mean, The Empire Strikes Back is a classic too. So probably those two.
That's awesome. Return of the Jedi is my favorite original trilogy film.
Yeah.
No, very nice.
Yeah.
I think we actually just talked about this in a recent podcast. Yeah, because I actually switched from Empire to Jedi to Empire again.
You just go, can't figure it out.
Yeah. Well, for a while there, I'm like, well, Jedi has both the space battle and the land battle. But then I've always been, when I was quite young, my favorite was the AT-ATs, so I just love that land battle so much.
Yeah. All right. So, what kind of book is this writing that we're talking about this week, and who's it for?
So it's for general audiences. So, you know, you don't have to have any particular philosophical background or spiritual background or religious background to write it, to read it. It's just written for everybody. And it's called One with the Force, 18 Universal Truths in Star Wars. So it's looking at some of the deep philosophical themes behind the Star Wars movies, drawing on stuff that George Lucas has talked about. He's elaborated quite a bit on some of the inspiration behind the Force and some of the philosophy behind the films, but then going deeply into both Eastern and Western traditions and how they line up with some of the concepts that we see illustrated in some of the key Star Wars scenes.
Awesome. And with that goes a lot of the themes that come kind of bundled into the parallels that George makes with the Force and those inspirations. Like what can you say about the kind of themes that this book kind of gets into?
Great. Well, George Lucas, for starters, he acknowledged the fact that Eastern traditions have had a big influence on Star Wars. There are ideas, for instance, in the Vedic tradition of ancient India, it talks about an all-pervading universal consciousness that underlies everything that exists. So it's a very similar parallel to the Force, to this all-pervading thing that's beyond the senses, that you can tap into, that you can even use. So a lot of Eastern parallels there. But ultimately, George Lucas had a universal perspective in mind when he created the Star Wars universe, and that's very clear from a lot of his comments. Do you think it would be useful to your audience to hear the analogy of the blind man and the elephant, which George Lucas does refer to?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Let's go for it.
Okay, great. So for those who may not have heard it, in this analogy, there are a bunch of blind individuals and they want to know what an elephant is like. They've never experienced one before. And so they come upon one and each individual touches a different part of the elephant. So one person touches its ear and it says, oh, okay, so an elephant is like a fan. It's flat and wide. And another one touches its trunk and says, oh, no, what are you talking about? It's more like a rope or a snake. It's long and flexible and narrow. Another one touches the leg, says it's strong and sturdy like a tree. So they're all accurately describing one part of the elephant, but they're inaccurately coming to the conclusion that that's the whole elephant. So this analogy has been applied to different religions and philosophies, that they're like different blind individuals who are accurately perceiving some aspects of life, but not seeing the whole picture, not seeing the whole elephant. So George Lucas, he's referred to this analogy. He likes it. He agrees with it. And he very much had a universal perspective on things. So he wanted to get at what the whole elephant is like, not just to support this particular religion, that particular philosophy. So anyway, that universal perspective really comes out when you're reading about some of the inspiration behind Star Wars, how George Lucas wanted to, he said he wanted to inspire young audiences a certain kind of spirituality, not necessarily to get them to join any particular organization or tradition, but to have some sense of some underlying truth, some universal truth that shows up in many, many places. So give them a glimpse of the whole elephant.
Great. Wow. That is an interesting analogy. Yeah.
Yeah. It makes, I definitely can see where it's coming from.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because from everyone's individual perspective, you only see what you see, right?
Right.
Got to put all the pieces together to get the big picture. And I see how that definitely is applied to what George was doing.
Totally. Yeah. You know, it's interesting when you put it that way, for sure, because I always think of now I know this is like amongst Star Wars fans, this tends to be like a more controversial subject with whether or not, depending on what films you grew up with. And I'm curious to hear your opinion on this, having grown up with the first 3 films and then later having done his prequels. But what is your opinion on the midi-chlorians? You know, because those movies are the ones that we grow up with, and quite frankly, I'm a big fan. So
you always count your own midi-chlorians.
Yeah, I always like this idea that there's some ties to the physical, you know, and I don't know, it's just I've always never had a problem with it. But what's your opinion about that? And is there anything in this book that might actually refer to that?
Yes, not specifically, but I will just say that from many Eastern traditions, from their perspective, yes, there is this universal consciousness, but it's filtered through individual bodies, individual nervous systems. And so the state of your body very much affects the state of your consciousness at any given time. And so, you know, if you were to correlate having more midichlorians with having a particularly pure, clear nervous system through meditation, through philosophical study and all that, then you can definitely see a parallel there, that some bodies, some physiologies are better set up to support deeper experiences of this all-pervading reality.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That lines up with how the midi-chlorians communicate to the Force, you know, like
is a satisfactory answer for you, Josh? Are you?
I'm satisfied.
All right.
I'm satisfied.
Awesome.
Okay. So, how do you define the balance, in context of both Star Wars and the various religious traditions? I know it's a loaded question there, but like, how would you define balance, I guess, in the grand scheme of things? Because the balance of the Force is like a big conversation, you know, in Star Wars. It's a big element within the story.
Especially because you only hear it from the one side. We were kind of referring to what we were talking about earlier. You don't really hear it from the Jedi's perspective. Yeah.
So like based on the real world, you know, inspirations here, like how would you define the balance of the Force? You know, what do you think George is getting at here, having drawn off of, you know, real world stuff here?
Sure. So I'll just mention that in The Last Jedi, there's actually an interesting conversation about balance between Luke and Rey, when he asks her to close her eyes and share what she feels, and she starts talking about life, but also death and decay that feeds new life. And you see like the skeleton of an animal underground that's like nourishing the soil so it can give rise to new life. So this idea that there are opposing forces and there's a natural balance between them, that has a lot of Eastern parallels. So in, again, the Vedic tradition of ancient India, there's a force of creation, there's a force of destruction, and their interplay drives the evolution of the universe. And so again, balance is the key theme here between them. If one of them is, well, for instance, if you take the analogy of a forest fire, a little forest fire may actually be helpful because it clears out some of the underbrush. So it's a helpful application of a destructive force. But if the fire is completely out of control, burns down the whole forest, then you have a problem. Or another analogy is if you have you want to build a beautiful house, but there's a really old beaten up piece of property, building on that site, you may need to bulldoze that old building first before you can build a new house. So there's a positive application of destructive forces, and there's a positive interplay between creative and destructive forces in life. But it does get out of hand when one of those forces completely overshadows the other one. And so, just destroying all the houses in a neighborhood, that would be probably not useful.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting to see that in Star Wars, but also in reality, where you kind of see people gravitate towards one side or the other instead of seeing it as a whole. So it's like the Jedi, right, as an example, were all just about the light side, at least towards the end with the fall of the Jedi Order.
Yeah.
They kind of lost their way of the balance, right? Which you see Qui-Gon trying to get back to. Yeah,
totally. I mean, it's interesting because I think a lot of people look at the Jedi in that trilogy as the good guys but really it's like they've lost their way, right? This is like the downfall of that whole dogma, right? And it's, I think in some ways it's like it is the Force kind of balancing what's going on in the galaxy, right? It's allowed this evil to rise, and yet it's created this chosen one to then later bring balance. But first,
which he does, but it's not how they're expecting.
Not just how they expect it. Yeah. They all have to be wiped out first. Yeah, exactly. I don't know. I mean, it is interesting how all things kind of come to a balance in the end. But yeah. Interpretation,
I think. Yeah, we keep going back to interpretation. Just becomes such a key element to a lot of this stuff.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. What is the significance of intuition and non-attachment in both the Jedi philosophy and in Eastern spiritual practices, or in Christianity would be perhaps like monks, right? What kind of things can you talk about that you've written about that kind of relates to that, with how people know the Jedi to be with their big no attachments rule?
Sure. Well, if you don't mind, I'll do intuition first and then non-attachment. So intuition, that theme comes up in a lot of the Star Wars movies, just in the basic phrase, search your feelings. It comes up when Leia, she realizes that Luke is her brother, and she says, somehow I've known that all along. So there's this theme of, yes, that's the other one. Even just the phrase, I have a very bad feeling about this. In all of these cases, the speakers, they're not doing some sort of intellectual analysis, this plus this plus this equals this outcome. That's why I come to this conclusion. It's a very direct insight, a gut reaction to a situation. It's giving them a subtle level of insight that most people on an everyday basis don't have. So intuition is also a big theme in many Eastern traditions. It's thought to be something that develops as one grows towards higher states of consciousness. And then you also do see similar themes in Western traditions. In the Bible, it refers to insight. Various individuals in the Bible are said to have very great insight into the nature of things. So it's like a very subtle level of the mind that goes beyond just sheer rational thinking.
Yeah, awesome. Well, thanks for that. Let's see. I've got all these questions kind of. They don't all kind of flow into each other, so forgive me if they seem a little bullet pointy, but yeah, we had a bit of limited time to kind of scan through what you had, what you'd provided us here. So it's great to ask some of these questions. So sorry if they feel a little like out of nowhere.
Not at all. Although I realized I didn't answer about non-attachment, so I can make a quick comment on that if you like.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. So from an Eastern perspective, non-attachment, that again is a result of higher states of consciousness that are cultivated through things like meditation. So for instance, from a Vedic standpoint, through meditation, one can gradually, naturally cultivate an inner state of peace and even bliss that's just a permanent reality, not through effort, but just through as a natural outcome of certain meditation practices. And so when you have very deep peace and bliss inside of you, you're not so attached to what goes on the outside. You're going to have some preferences over others, some likes and dislikes. Sure, that's fine. but you're so rooted in this peace and this bliss that can be cultivated. You're so rooted in that there's not so much attachment to outcomes. So I see that as similar to a lot of the Star Wars films when they deal with attachment. Obviously, the Jedi, they don't wear fancy clothes or anything like that, and that's one way the theme comes up. But there's also quite a bit of content on attachment and its harmful effects in the prequel trilogy when Anakin is so attached to Padme, to his wife, surviving, that he's willing to just do anything to keep her alive. And, obviously, I think having a connection to one's loved ones is a healthy and wonderful thing. But, to absolutely throw out your moral compass and just do anything to try to achieve a particular outcome, that would be one of the harmful effects of attachment. So I think that's a big theme in the prequel trilogy.
Right.
No,
Yeah.
so true. And it's always good to have that kind of duality, I think, right? Kind of like you want to have attachment, but not to overdo it.
Oh,
And
for sure.
yeah, it's on Star Wars. We kind of see the extremes.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Like, again, there's that theme of imbalance there,
Mm-hmm.
especially in Anakin.
Yeah,
right?
I appreciate you talking to us about this, just because I don't think I've actually looked at Star Wars through that specific lens before.
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So how would you interpret the themes of death and immortality in Star Wars in relation to Eastern beliefs?
A lot of similarities there. So,
Yeah.
in Western traditions, or I should say in Western modern culture, death is seen as a very negative thing. And I don't just mean tragic death or young death, but I mean, even when people have lived a long and fulfilling life, we see that as a very negative thing. We see it as a complete end, a cessation. It's to be avoided at almost any cost. And it's just interesting because the Jedi don't have that perspective. They talk about death as being a natural part of life. Yoda says, "Twilight is upon me and soon night must fall. That is the way of things, the way of the Force." And, Anakin's attempts to circumvent his wife's death, that leads him down to the dark side. So the Jedi have this perspective that, it's a natural part of life, but then they also, of course, have a belief in immortality. And so it's interesting that the Sith, who are the ones who go to great lengths to avoid death for very unnatural means, they're not the ones who gain individual immortality. It's actually the Jedi who discover that secret, so that even though they're not clinging to this physical body, this mortal life, at the same time, they learn how to become Force spirits and to communicate with the living Jedi and all that. So, death is not seen as the ultimate end. There's a continuation after death. And Yoda says to rejoice for those around you who transform into the Force. So he's not even just talking about the Jedi. He's saying that literally everything that dies, it goes back to its source. It goes back to the Force. All of those ideas are very much paralleled in Eastern traditions. Eastern traditions also see death as just part of a natural evolution, a natural cycle. Some of them refer to reincarnation specifically, which is not really represented in the Star Wars universe. But they also talk about things like merging with the source of all things, merging with that universal consciousness, and a continuation after death. So death is not seen as the ultimate end in Eastern traditions either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do wish that we read a book not too well. It was about maybe a year ago or something. It was called Shadows of the Sith. Do you remember reading that one?
Yeah, we brought this up a few times. Actually.
Brought it up a few times. Yeah, there was this really cool sequence that I just love, and I wish that that they had put this in the later films, like in the sequel films. But it's a scene in which Anakin presents himself to Luke in his Force ghost form for the first time since he saw him on Endor, and it's in a moment of peril when he is like being surrounded by these 9 kind of hooded dark figures, very weird sort of obscure stuff, like what were they again? They were like from
I remember the scene with Anakin. I don't remember who was fighting.
They were like almost as if they were basically the ring race, from Lord of the Rings.
Anakin as a Force ghost was able to fight them, but he had to give up his ability to appear
Yeah. So
in Force Ghost form.
Yeah. So how they did it was they explained. So they provided this action sequence as a way of Anakin kind of shows up in this like beam of light and like kind of eradicates all these things that are about to that kill Luke.
It's a lot like Aragorn, isn't it?
It's a bit like a bit like a bit like that. And he uses almost the last of his ability to I guess manifest a physical iteration of himself in the through the Force, right? Like how Ben appears to Luke and Yoda appears to Luke and stuff. So he gives up the last of his power to do that to save him, and that's the main reason I think why we don't see him, in the sequel films, and that's sort of the backdoor answer that they give for that. But I mean, if you ask me, I think they just still were in this period of time where they just didn't want to involve those actors in those films at that point. But now that seems to be over, which is nice. But I mean, what's your if you can make any kind of connection to that? Like, I mean, they introduced something to the canon, which is this idea that this physical representation, this re-manifestation through the Force of them showing up to people in the physical world, and then that being kind of like a limited ability in some ways. Like, is there any kind of connection there to any sort of Eastern related belief, or is that just a product of the fictional story?
Hey, just give me 1 second. I need a drink here.
Sure, no problem.
Sorry, I didn't want to do that while you were talking. I was afraid it would be a distracting background noise.
Oh, no worries.
It's an interesting question. Nothing comes to mind specifically. Again, there is this idea of reincarnation, so taking on many bodies and then eventually reaching enlightenment, reaching higher states of consciousness, and then no longer needing to take on bodies. But in terms of specifically being a ghost or a spirit, I'm offhand. I'm not thinking of anything.
Okay, so that's just a Star Wars thing then.
Sounds like it.
I think so.
Maybe the Western tradition.
Maybe that question could have been shorter.
It was a little long-winded. I'm not going to say anything.
Okay, so what can you explain the significance of the Noble Eightfold Path in relation to the Jedi's moral code?
It's a good question. It's a lot to unpack right there.
Yeah. Sorry, it's like for anyone listening who is like, trying to get an idea of perhaps what this book is about, and maybe feel free to summarize it in short, but just in general, kind of hitting the mark there somehow.
Sure. I mean, just broadly speaking, many different religious and philosophical traditions put tremendous emphasis on knowledge, the value of gaining knowledge, intellectual knowledge that helps you live better, that helps you evolve towards higher states of consciousness. So that would be what you just mentioned would be the Buddhist approach to that in different techniques for spiritual development. And, I don't know if I'd see one-to-one correspondence in all 8 of those steps in the Star Wars universe, but certainly the Jedi put a lot of emphasis on acting in the most virtuous way they can in evolution and just trying to fulfill their full potential as human beings. So I guess those are some broad points I would say.
Awesome. Yeah. Okay. That summarizes it. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
I'm just very curious. How much research did you do to like look into George's background of going into this book?
I was wondering this too. What kind of research George himself did before actually coming to the end of the script, which will be
you
filmed.
Exactly. Yeah, like what kind of research did you do into George that he did research into?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, with regards to my research about George, I looked at a range of Star Wars books, and just anytime he started talking about the inspiration behind the Force, anytime he elaborated on that topic, I looked at those books. I looked at his quotes, to make sure this wasn't a matter of me projecting things onto the movies, that these were very much the ideas that he intended to bring out, and that became very clear very quickly based on a lot of different sources, just times when he's discussed at length some of the inspiration behind the films, behind the Force. He put a lot of thought into that. As for him, he was influenced by a range of traditions, and specific influences. He composed the original Star Wars script when he was living in San Francisco, so that's an area that was very much influenced by New Age spirituality, which a lot draws quite a bit from Eastern philosophy. So in that way, just through osmosis, he was exposed to all these ideas. But also the Gary Kurtz, the producer for some of the Star Wars movies, had a background in comparative religion and specifically a lot of Eastern traditions. He discussed these subjects with George Lucas while George Lucas was composing that first screenplay, and even recommended philosophical changes to the original drafts of that first Star Wars screenplay.
Gary Kurtz.
Yeah. And also, George Lucas learned the transcendental meditation technique, which comes from India. So it comes from the Vedic tradition. And when one learns that technique, they also they learn a whole bunch of the principles behind it. So, in many different ways, he was exposed to Eastern principles, and we very much see that play out in his films. At the same time, again, he had this universal perspective. He's referred to himself as a Methodist Buddhist or a Buddhist Methodist at different times. Again, just showing this meeting point between East and West, where, I think culturally he was definitely influenced by Methodism and by Christianity, but he also had this interest in the Eastern traditions, and Buddhism was one of those.
Yeah, interesting.
It's actually very interesting to see how it all kind of comes together. It sounds like George was just at like the right place at the right time for all these ideas to just come together and manifest in what we now know as Star Wars.
Yeah. Yeah. And
I agree.
Yeah, for sure. It's, and, having a lot of influence from fantasy of his time as a kid,
Right,
I
with
mean,
Flash Gordon and stuff, right?
well, that as well. But I mean, on a more deep level, I'm sure Lord of the Rings also plays a huge part in his childhood, like growing up with that very deep fantasy world, and having that be a very Christian Catholic story,
Right.
at the root is also probably ever present in his in his
Psyche? What really caught my interest of the last part you're talking about there. I had no idea that Gary Kurtz would have had that sort of influence on it. I'm curious where you came across that information, and just maybe a little more detail on that.
So in the book I wrote, Lucas was exposed to these Eastern traditions in part by Gary Kurtz, the producer of the first two Star Wars films. Kurtz had a background in comparative religion, as well as in Buddhism, Hinduism, and Native American teachings. He discussed these topics at length with Lucas, recommending philosophical changes to the early drafts of the first Star Wars screenplay. Yes, that was from an online article called The Religious Affiliation of Director George Lucas by a group called Adherence, and I have a link to it for anyone who wants to check out the details there.
Yeah, sure. We could just share that in the bottom description.
Yeah, sounds good. It's always interesting hearing about, part of the reason why we ask questions is just I guess there's so much there. I mean, there's a lot out there about George, but there's certainly less about the other people in his life that played an influence over his creative output, right?
Yeah, that's what caught my ear too, because you don't really hear about the other people that
you almost never hear about his ex-wife, and you almost never hear about Gary all that much, or other people,
or many other unnamed people, I'm sure.
Oh yeah. I wish there was more about Rick McCallum during that 90s period through the 2000s too, because I mean he was a big producer on those three films.
Yeah.
And I always think that it's what other people kind of played some sort of creative influence out of where he took his story. And George is a pretty stubborn guy, so it takes a pretty special person to be able to have that kind of influence over him.
From what you were sharing here, it sounds like Gary probably had a huge influence on what we now know of as the Force.
Yeah. So thank you for answering the question, because it is it always makes us curious, just
I'm gonna look into this more, I think.
Yeah, who's inner circle?
Go for it. Well, you're probably already familiar with the fact that he was influenced by Joseph Campbell. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, that too. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Of course. For anybody who Yeah, exactly.
Please, yeah. If you want to enlighten our
just-
audience on that, yeah.
Yeah, for anybody who doesn't know, Joseph Campbell was a comparative mythologist. So he looked at the mythologies from lots of different religions and philosophies, and he saw some very strong common themes. And so he wrote about that. And in particular, he talked about the hero's journey. So this whole series of steps that take place in the storyline of any individual hero, which you see a lot in different movies. And then George Lucas was so inspired by these ideas that he very consciously and intentionally brought them into his first Star Wars screenplay. And indeed, if you line up the hero's journey next to the script of the original Star Wars screenplay, there's a very clear correspondence in the themes of the hero's journey.
Mm-hmm.
And it's cool how George kind of stacked it as well, where there's a hero's journey within a hero's journey. Because A New Hope itself is a hero's journey, and then the original trilogy is a hero's journey.
Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah, it is interesting, and I've seen a piece of fan art online where they've taken the there's like a visual guide to the hero's journey, and they have like replaced all the little areas where there would be like some text or something like that on this like kind of circular kind of map thing, and they've replaced it with like little cartoon Star Wars characters and like a little thing from the story.
Okay. To like show where it would be on like the graph.
Yeah, to show where it would be in the hero's journey kind of thing, right? So yeah, it's it plays a big part. Let's see, how does the concept of the Force in Star Wars relate to more like Western beliefs, like with perhaps like Christian understandings of God and like how like what can you say about that?
It very much corresponds with biblical descriptions of God being something that's omnipresent. So that's a theme in certain biblical passages that God is everywhere. God pervades everything. That's a very similar concept to God. I mean, and even in the Bible, it says something along the lines of He, God, so He is not far from any one of us, for in Him we live and move and have our being. So very similar concept there, and also has a lot of Eastern parallels to the divine being something not just human-like, not just a man with, or a very glorified man, if you will, with particular desires and laws and all that, but in this much more abstract sense of something that's all pervading, just a divine that's everywhere.
Yeah, I noticed in your book you have a credit at the front to the NIV. So I just wondered, like, I mean, maybe it might be a lot, maybe it might be just a few things, but I guess you've referenced a lot from the New International Version in your book, right?
Yes. So for your audiences, because they won't have seen the structure of my book, the first part goes very deeply into Eastern themes. And then the second part, that focus broadens and it looks at some additional Eastern traditions. The first part is largely about the Vedic tradition of ancient India, because there are some very, very deep parallels there. But in the second part, it goes into Eastern traditions like Buddhism and Taoism and Sikhism, but it also goes into Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and even to Native American and First Nations teachings, because they have a similar idea to the Force as well, usually referred to as the Great Spirit. And so in my research, I drew on all these different traditions. The reason there's a specific reference to the Christian Bible is just for copyright reasons, that certain sources are more carefully copyrighted than others. So in that case, they said, well, if you quote over X number of verses, that's fine, but you have to include an extra notice.
Gotcha. Okay.
Actually, didn't know you need to do that.
I didn't know that either.
Learn something new every day.
Yeah. What kind of things can you say in your book about fear and inner peace? I mean, those are two very common themes through Star Wars, and something that I think the Jedi struggle with a lot is combating fear and struggling to find inner peace.
Anakin is a prime example, right?
Anakin is a prime example of that, and Luke is a prime example of having to combat fear, right? And I just I think what would you say about that that you've written about?
Sure. I would say that it relates strongly to the idea of meditation. So we do see the Jedi meditating in various scenes, like in the original movie in the prequel trilogy, I should say, in The Phantom Menace. Qui-Gon temporarily pauses and meditates in the middle of a fight. And so I think that's an instance where he's going inward, he's finding that inner peace, and then he's able to come back and combat his opponent from a much more settled state of a mind. And there are other scenes as well where the Jedi meditate, usually in the prequel and the sequel trilogies. But even in the original trilogy, this idea of using the Force, tapping into the Force, the way they do that is they go beyond the senses. Like, for instance, when Luke destroys the Death Star, right before that, he closes his eyes, he turns off his targeting device on his computer. So he's letting go of reliance on the senses. He's going inward, and from that basis, he intuitively senses exactly when he needs to release his torpedo to destroy the Death Star. Mm-hmm. So there's just a lot of emphasis on tapping into the Force, on gaining inner peace through that. And that would be, I think, the way to combat fear. Certainly that has a lot of parallels to Eastern traditions, that when the mind can transcend surface levels of thought, go into deeper and deeper levels of thought, find the source of thought, find a level of the mind that is very peaceful, very deep, very undisturbed. And then the more one does that, the more that one can draw that out into their everyday activities. And so in the Upanishads, that's an ancient Vedic text, it says, certainly fear is born of duality. So in other words, being completely caught up in the duality of our modern life, light and darkness, or all these opposites that govern everything that happens. And so by bringing the mind through meditation to a very unified, simple level of awareness, a level of oneness, and by repeatedly dipping into that and bringing it out into life, one is much better anchored to deal with situations, and one doesn't revert to fear so easily.
Mm. Yeah, I've always liked that scene where Luke turns off his targeting computer. To me, it's always been like a very simple act of faith, just how he listens to that little voice in his head with Ben, let go, Luke. And, with the Qui-Gon scene, I love how you mentioned that, because you see such stark contrast between the Jedi and the Sith in that moment. And it gets overlooked a lot. But when Qui-Gon is like kneeling down to meditate in the moment, like in this battle that could consume his entire life, and I guess, ultimately it's the end of him, but like he's like weirdly at peace in this moment of chaos and imbalance, right? And
or he's taking a moment to try to refine that piece.
Yeah, he's taking a moment to find it, right? But I love how it like contrasts with just this very thin laser wall, and you see the opposite of him on the other side of that wall being a Sith Lord, stewing in his rage, building anger and hatred. Because that's where his strength is. That's where he gains his strength. That's where he gains his power. Is like, on the opposite end of this like thing, of this like of this imbalance, right? And it's a cool kind of
duality,
physical representation. Very nice to get those. I think that's why Star Wars is such a cool set of like cool movies. Like there's so much visual storytelling in those movies that is unlike so many other movies. That
there's always this depth to everything.
There's a lot of depth. Like you could watch Star Wars on mute or without dialogue and just have the music and have the visuals and the music tell the story that you need, right? Like you get almost everything out of that. Like it's really, the strength is not necessarily in the dialogue of those movies. It's in the visual storytelling. Most of the time.
I think you would get a large portion of it for sure.
Yeah. So in what ways does your book discuss? Oh wait, sorry, we already went into this immortality discussion. What role does the concept of right and wrong play in both Star Wars and teachings?
Sure. So I'll just say first that from a Vedic perspective, again, that's ancient Indian, right action is evolutionary action. So from a Vedic perspective, the purpose of life is for us to grow and to evolve towards higher states of consciousness to reach our full potential as human beings. And so actions that promote that goal, actions that are evolutionary, actions that help us expand in our awareness, and also actions that help others do the same, those would be seen as right actions. Anything that inhibits that process would be seen as wrong actions. You can use the analogy of a river. It's like there's a river and it's flowing towards an ocean of truth, of fulfillment, of our full potential. And so it's like we're on canoes on that river, and the river is going to keep flowing in that direction because that's the ultimate nature of life from a Vedic perspective. But we are individual beings with our own free will. And so we can paddle with the current or against it. We can get stuck in little eddies, little snags along the way. But I think that idea of right action being evolutionary action works very well with the Star Wars universe as well. I think the Jedi are trying to grow and to expand, to reach their full potential as human beings, to be able to face even extremely difficult situations and still handle them in an honorable way. And I think the Sith have less emphasis on that. Of course, in Western traditions, there's a lot of emphasis on right and wrong, the duality of that. I just think the Eastern perspective brings some nice nuance to that concept.
Mm.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting to see just comparing it directly to Jedi and Sith, because Jedi always try to flow with the Force and sense where the Force wants to go, whereas the Sith is what, why they get the yellow eyes and everything, is they're intentionally trying to manipulate the Force to do exactly what they want.
Yeah.
So it's interesting, to see where that pulls from.
It's a great point.
Yeah. Yeah, it's always I think recently we reread the book Darth Plagueis, and it's a fascinating book with lots of insight into how these Sith lords commune with the Force, how they do their thing, because in the films we get a lot of the Jedi perspective, but this particular book is not only is it probably one of the best Star Wars books I think we've ever read, but it really catches you from, you see it through this other angle, through this other lens of how the Sith operate and how they look at things. And it's interesting to see how they look at the Force as like in a different way. It is an ally still for them, because they still,
it's where they draw their strength.
It's where they draw their strength still. It's just different, right? It's just a very, very different way. And they're very selfish people and very very angry people,
looking inward instead of looking out.
Exactly. Yeah. So as far as Star Wars goes, I mean, like in the films, especially, one of the reasons why Return of the Jedi was such a good favorite movie of mine is that there is this theme of forgiveness, like at the very end. There is this redemption with Luke and his father. And I think, what kind of things would you say about, citations you've made about compassion and forgiveness, and drawing parallels to Star Wars there?
So redemption is a big theme that I talk about. And obviously that's a major theme in Western traditions, huge theme in Christianity, of course. But you also see it in Eastern traditions. From an Eastern standpoint, redemption would be the cultivation of higher states of consciousness, which are a state that's beyond sin, if you want to use that word, that's beyond that darkness. And it's interesting because in those Eastern traditions, they teach that the true self of every person is something that's beyond any destructive things they do in their life. There's a true self that transcends all of those negative actions that they might have engaged in. And that works very nicely in parallel to Darth Vader and also to Kylo Ren, where the Jedi that they encounter, they all bring up this point that, no, actually, this isn't your true self. Your true self, you need to get back to your true self. So that's a big theme in Eastern traditions as well, that due to stress, due to ignorance, we can do things that are harmful. But if we can get beyond those limitations in our mind, in our awareness, if we can evolve through meditation, through other practices, if we can get back in touch with our true self, then we'll very naturally not do those things, and we'll very naturally achieve redemption.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that, even just taking to my own life.
Yeah.
I just went through a very stressful period, and I know there's a lot of, I guess, lack of joy and stuff just from the hard time I've been through. I kind of try to get back to where it was before that. So.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, do you have any other questions, Blake?
I guess I'm just curious how long you worked on this novel for, because this is a lot of information. You had to look across a lot of different resources.
Yeah, how long
put
did
all
this
this
take?
together?
Yeah.
Thank you. It took a few years off and on. I was teaching, and then I would work on this when I wasn't teaching. So yeah, it took a while, but it was a fun project for sure. You know, on the one hand, I'm really passionate about the philosophy and the spirituality, and on the other hand, it's just really fun to have an excuse to go explore a bunch of stars and geek out about that stuff with folks like you. So, it was rewarding.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it. And I'm also very glad that you took the time to put something like this together, because I think a lot of us had a sense that George had reached out to a lot of these different places and a lot of inspiration, but it's nice to finally see a direct comparison to a lot of these different cultures and religions and stuff, and see just kind of where it all connects together.
Yeah. It's also such a pleasure to have a doctor on who, I know you've spent many years in your field of education, probably studying this stuff. So, to have that level of insight, and connecting, plugging those things into Star Wars is very cool. Earlier this year, I think it was, we had a previous guest who returned, Dr. Jess Tompkins, who wrote a psychology-related book on the Mandalorian and Book of Boba Fett, and very, very interesting to hear that perspective of like psychology plugged into Star Wars and these characters and stuff. Just like things that like most people wouldn't like, that aren't in that field of education and knowledge. Things that you're like, oh, cool. Like there's like making these. Yeah.
Have the perspective to kind of see things at a deeper levels just from their own.
Yeah, just like in a different
experience and research and stuff.
Right. Exactly.
Well, thank you. No, it was fun for me to share.
Yeah. Thanks so much. So I'm just curious, just as we close up here, where can people find your book and in general, like how can they get a copy?
Yeah, it's available. Sure. It's available on multiple platforms. So it's available on Amazon, but also Barnes & Noble, Bookshop, and Books A Million. So all of those. A lot of people just get it from Amazon, but it's available on the other platforms as well. And do you want me to give them my website address?
Oh, yeah.
Or were you going to do that?
Feel free, and I'll repeat it at the end. Yeah.
Okay. So to follow me or for links to where my book is sold, you can go to my website. That's kristanoble.com. So KRISTANOBLE.com.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you so much. And I guess we'll be now that we have a bit more time afterwards, I'll be going through it a bit more thoroughly, but definitely encourage all our audience to check that out. If there's a student in school who's listening to our show and checking out this book, is there a class they might be taking that they can refer to your book for information on things?
Sure. A world religions class, certainly if they're taking anything about Eastern traditions, there would definitely be subjects that come up there. If there were a class on films, that's also a possibility.
Yeah, great. Yeah, my wife took an Eastern religions class a few years ago. So yeah, and she found it very interesting. But yeah, I guess I could have referred this book if it came out a bit sooner. So yeah, there you go. Perfect. Thank you so much to Dr. Krista Noble. Thank you so much. We'll be in touch, and thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you so much. Oh, thank you so much. I had a great time.
All right, a big thank you to our audience for tuning in. A big thank you to to our co-host Blake, and we will see you in a week. And just a reminder to our audience to check out all the links in the description down below. And for those for the website KristaNoble.com. Any other socials are down there. May the force be with you, and we will see you in the next episode of Star Wars Escape Pod.